Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to part 3 of 4 video lessons about reformations and religious warfare. My name is Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. Today, we are going to talk about the Counter-Reformation, or as it's sometimes called, the Catholic Reformation. And this is the Catholic response to what Martin Luther started, to the Protestant Reformation. So let's talk about a couple of key ideas here. So the Reformation, because of its speed and reach, did shape the Catholic response. A couple of things I want you to pay attention to here. The Council of Trent, the Society of Jesus, which later became known as the Jesuits, the Inquisition, the Index, this idea of renewed religious emotionalism, and this manifested in the form of Baroque art. My folks, we will talk about Baroque art in detail in class. And then, of course, you have religious warfare and a new Bible. Let's back up just a second and talk about the Council of Trent for a minute. The Council of Trent did not fundamentally change everything about the church, but it did solidify Catholic doctrine and provide what many have called a spiritual renewal for Catholicism. And the key ideas that were laid down in the Council of Trent have carried the church through all the way through to the 20th century. So the Council of Trent was very, very significant, that it addressed a lot of the major issues. For example, you could no longer buy church offices. This was an idea known as simony, where people could buy a bishop for their son. A noble could buy that church office and have it given to his eldest son. That practice was ended. Any cleric that kept concubines or prostitutes, that practice was stopped immediately. There was widespread change in the education of Catholic priests, and every diocese was required to have a seminary so that Catholic priests could properly be educated. Now, what's interesting is a lot of the reforms that Erasmus and Martin Luther wanted adopted were adopted. Indulgences were stopped. They were banned. The popes of the Reformation, or the Counter-Reformation, were very, very different. It was a stark contrast to the Renaissance popes that were very licentious and just represented the absolute worst of humanity. Many of these church abuses were cleaned up by the Council of Trent, but they couldn't reconcile with the Protestants because they would not reaffirm or affirm that Scripture was the only dictate of church policy. They said that tradition also holds, and so that the Protestants were not going to go along with that. Another important society known as the Jesuits, they were very key, and their major purpose, they were founded by Ignatius Loyola, who you see there, the name right there, Ignatius Loyola, that was their founder, and its goal was to spread the Christian faith as much as possible through good works, through charity, and through education primarily. So this was a very important society. The Inquisition was also started, where the Catholic Church systematically rooted out heretics and people who were going against church doctrine. It didn't have much sway outside of the Papal States, but it really got things under control within the Papal States. Virtually all the heretics were rooted out. This thing called the Index, which we'll talk about more in class, and Baroque art and religious warfare we'll discuss more in class. But I want to give you this big picture kind of concept map of how things shake down. So prior to the Reformation, you just have Christianity, and that was just Catholicism. After that break, the Protestant Reformation results in Catholicism, where there's really nothing underneath it, and then Protestantism. So I want you to understand the different types of Protestantism that happened, or that developed because of Martin Luther and his 95 Theses. So you have Calvinism and you have Lutheranism. Those are the primary ones we need to be concerned with. If you're thinking in terms of modern day, of right now, obviously there are hundreds of Protestant denominations out there. But for our purposes, for AP Euro, you really need to focus on Calvinism and Lutheranism. And from Calvinism develops a few other different folks. Okay, you have Presbyterians, you have the Puritans, and you have the Huguenots. Okay, so that's very important. These are the folks you really want to pay attention to. All right, so the church's problems, I want to review this a little bit because I want to make sure that we're on board and that we understand how and why the Reformation was even possible. So there were several charges of greed, which were true. The worldly political power was being challenged because you have the rise of the modern nation state and the centralization of political power, which Henry VII is a great example of that centralization. You have weariness of the dependence on the church. People were just tired of having to rely on the church for every little thing. And they also did not appreciate the constraints of that church. There was a growing human confidence. As opposed to original sin, people were really starting to feel this humanism vibe. all right, that started in the Renaissance. And they're not all about the fact that we're inherently evil. So that was really a method that the church used very effectively for a long, long time to maintain its control. This idea that we're all evil and that without the church, all of us are going to hell. People are like, well, I don't know. Humanism says something else. And I think we like that better. So people were moving towards that direction and away from this concern of original sin. The church also became very defensive in the face of criticism. It silenced all critics as fast as possible. Violence was a common method of silencing anybody who was a critic or who was someone deemed a heretic. And people were very confused by how scholasticism worked because most people were not educated in the church, and scholasticism was a product, an intellectual product of the church. So these were the problems the church had to deal with. There was also massive corruption in the Renaissance papacy. We'll talk about Rodrigo Borgia in class. I talked about him a little bit previous to this during the Renaissance portion, but we're going to talk about him in more detail because this guy was one piece of work. You think Leo X was bad? Wait till you get a load of this guy. European population was also increasingly anti-clerical, as in they were against these priests and these bishops having control over their daily lives and control over their destinies. And this absenteeism of church leaders, at this point, bishops didn't even have to live in their own diocese. They could be bishop of a diocese and never go there, ever. They were never there. Absentee leaders. And so people didn't respect that. They're like, who the heck is this bishop I got to listen to? I've never seen this guy. And then, of course, the controversy over the sale of indulgences was a major, major problem, which the church did address. They also addressed the absenteeism issue. Bishops now, anybody who was assigned a diocese had to live in that diocese. So that helped things a little bit. Now, there was also a convergence of unique circumstances that allowed all of this to take place. Let's talk about that for a few minutes. All right, so cultural. Cultural changes give rise to political, intellectual, social, and economic changes, okay? It's like a cycle that continually reinforces itself, okay? When you have a cultural change, that'll result in an economic and religious and political, which will then reinforce that cultural change and enhance it. But you have better educated urban populace, much more critical of the church than the rural peasantry. The rural peasantry largely didn't change much, certainly not during the Renaissance. If we recall, their lives didn't change. It was the elite that changed and the merchant class of folks that changed. But this better educated populace, they were not down with the church because they had more knowledge. And so the church couldn't sway them with, we have all the knowledge. No, they didn't. They no longer had the monopoly on knowledge anymore. Other people had access to this information. Renaissance monarchs were sick of the power of the church. Remember, these folks are obsessed with consolidating power. Okay, they're obsessed with the consolidating power and advancing their own interests, the interests of their nation. So they were sick of having to kowtow to the church. They're like over it. They're like, I'm not kowtowing to you. I want everybody to kowtow to me. Henry VIII is a prime example. 100 years before, what Henry VIII did would never have been possible. But because of the cultural changes that were happening, Henry VIII was like, I'm over it. I'm going to form my own dang church and I'm going to have my divorce. Society was more humanistic and more secular. This was a direct result of the Renaissance. And John Wycliffe, very famous English reformer, really played in and is a prime example of this sense of individualism, the sense that individual people matter and can make a difference, that it wasn't, that the sole focus wasn't on the church community. It was on what can I do as a human being to make a difference in the world. The printing press. My man Gutenberg, all right? My man Johannes Gutenberg. I love this guy, or Johann, however you want to say it. I love this guy. Love this guy. This guy single-handedly changed the course of human events. All right, with this invention of movable type, I know I've talked about him before, but you can never talk about Gutenberg too much. You can't get too much of Gutenberg. He's good times. So because of this movable type, and at the same time, manufacture of paper becomes easier and cheaper. This confluence of these two events really changed the way society functioned. Because it was cheaper and easier and more accessible to books and knowledge and papers, people read more, people learned more, people had access to this knowledge, and this helped undermine the power of the church and enhance the power of the people. It helped spread ideas before the church could even do anything about it. It was too late. The cat was out of the bag, and there was no way the cat was going back in. Cats don't like the bag, all right? Once you get them out, they don't want to go in. Okay, bad joke. Okay, sorry. So this spread of knowledge intensified the intellectual criticism of the church, and they really had no experience in refuting it because they've never had had to do so before. So this was a problem for them. And also the idea that individual people had agency, that individual people could communicate with God on their own. This appealed to urban folks and to people who were literate, that they could take an active role in this connection with God. And they were very happy about this. All right, let's look at political. Political is important. So, England, yes, England. Let's review what happened with Henry VIII. So you have this idea, the notion of the Renaissance prince, the idea that, similar to the idea of the Renaissance man, that you should be worldly and knowledgeable, you should be your own person, and you should develop your state in the best way that you can. So Henry VIII really took this to heart. As messed up as he was in a lot of ways, he was a very learned individual. Henry VIII really cared about education. He was a thinker. Henry VIII. He was a thinker, and he was really all about learning as much as he could. He loved learning, loved knowledge, loved books. So the recent War of the Roses created a sense of political instability for the Tudor dynasty. But Henry VII calmed things down. Henry VIII kind of messed it up a little bit. Certainly when he divorced Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, in order to marry Anne Boleyn. And in doing so, divorced himself from the Catholic Church. Now remember, under Henry VIII, nothing fundamentally changed with doctrine. All the sacraments were followed. The Mass was the same. Everything was the same, except now Henry's the head of the church. Religious doctrine in England would not change until Edward. Okay, and this is the reason why Henry went through all of this craziness. This should tell you that this is how significant a male heir was to Henry, that he would go through all of this. Okay, and you see these little memes over here tell me how I'm supposed to breathe with no air. The significance of a male heir was extremely significant, and so he was willing to go to great lengths to make sure that happened. I love this guy. He creates new church just to get a divorce, kills new wife anyway. You know, you gotta love Henry VIII. All right, so now let's talk about the Holy Roman Empire. Now, key idea with the Holy Roman Empire is it's decentralized, okay? Charles V is the emperor, but I use that term very loosely because he really was not emperor of anything. The decentralized nature of the empire made it impossible for him to rule as one would traditionally think an emperor would rule. The local noble princes really had control over their individual areas, and Charles V was not really in a position to change that. Okay, the Pope successfully challenged the monarch here, which is that being Charles V, which was why there were problems for Henry with his divorce and with Catherine. He was young, politically insecure, and he tried to govern a very huge realm, and that was not happening during what Luther was doing. Okay, that was a serious problem. He also, not only to the political, social, religious instability, he faced outside attacks from France and the Turks who were trying to undermine his empire. So he's got some issues here. In this instance, circumstances actually favor Luther because many of the German princes went with Luther. They went with Lutheranism. So this made governing even harder for Charles V. And I have this little meme up here. Holy Roman Empire. Neither holy nor Roman, nor really an empire. Discuss. Okay. We're going to learn more about the Holy Roman Empire in the next unit. But the big picture I want you to remember here is decentralized politics. Germany was not Germany in the sense of what we think of it today. You have various different princes ruling different religions, different cultures that were happening in this empire, which made it difficult to unite it. That is the end of part 3, and I'm sorry I have a little typo there. I will see you in part 4. I hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you next time.